Good to be with you today. It's a great privilege to take you into God's Word today, and specifically we're going to look at Genesis chapter 12, and we're covering Genesis 12 through 21, so we're going to be here a long time. And actually, we'll just skim through that, but if you have a Bible, find Genesis 12. Let me just say that being a guest speaker is kind of liberating. You can say anything you want and not get fired. And the worst that'll happen is you'll appreciate Pastor Greg and Susan all the more. So it's a good deal. But actually, I think we can just assume that it doesn't matter what I say. It's what does God want to say today? So are you open to that? Yes. And that may come through me. It may come in spite of me. But I know Tish has already prayed. But just take a moment of silence, will you? And could you open your heart to him and ask him to speak to you and to all of us together? Give us, Lord, the ears to hear and hearts to respond and lives to live out your deep, wide, high, low, loving desires. In your name, in your presence, Jesus our Emmanuel. Amen. Last week or week or two ago, Susan sent me this slide. I guess you're going to get into a teaching series 2020 Vision. I suspect that's Greg's eye. I don't know for sure, but he's the pastor that's always watching you. Anyway, want to have you give some thoughts to this new year coming up and just the future in general. And I'm pretty sure that we all have stuff that we hope happens, right? You may not dwell on it, you may not make resolutions, but you all have things that you hope do happen, things that you hope do not happen. And along the way, I dare say we all have things where those hopes are so high and seem fairly accessible, we want to make them happen. So here's where I want to go today especially. What do you want to make happen? Not that you know for sure you can do it, but you want things to be under control in our lives. I think that's instinctive. That's even part of being made in God's image, that we're responsible for this or that. But we often want to be in control. Anybody here like to be in control? At least a few things? Okay, quite a few of you. The rest of you, you're too lazy to get your hand up. But anyway, we all want to be in control. I mean, just real quick, what are some areas of life? I'll give you one, but then you can shout out some other examples where you would like to make something happen for the good. So for example, how many of you are parents of kids? About half of you. You want the best for your children, right? And your influence sometimes slips into making them do this or that. When they're really little, maybe you have to. But for example, your kids, you want your kids to get good grades in school. Let me address the students. Do your parents does it ever feel like they're nagging? Or you don't have to admit that. I'm seeing a few heads nod, right? And it's a fine line, isn't it, where you kind of make it happen. You nag them, and you go to the teacher and put the pressure on. You even pay somebody to give them higher SAT scores, or none of you would ever do that. But what are some other areas of life where you'd really like to make something happen? Parenting is one, but anything else? Health. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Losing weight. Okay. Work. Finances. That's a big one. All kinds of areas, right? So I'd like you to think just to yourself, what are some of those areas? And here's the question I want to ask. Where is God in that? He's there. He's always with us. He's always at work. But what is it you think he might be doing in some of your hopes, and especially those desires you have to have some degree of control? What do you think he's doing? And what I want to do is look at one of the Bible's most important stories that starts in Genesis 12. Here's the gist of it. It's about a married couple named Abraham and Sarah, originally Abram and Sarai. And they are given by God a huge promise that actually is nothing less than the beginnings of his plan to heal a broken world. The trouble is they have a long, long wait to see anything of that promise fulfilled, and that leads them to try to make things happen, to try to grab some control, and that doesn't go so well, but it leads God into giving them a wonderful, wonderful surprise. So let's just look at that, which holds this good news that God is in control and we're not. And that's really good news. But that God has surprises for us. So take a look at Genesis 12, starting with verse 1. The Lord said to Abram, go from your country. And he's living, by the way, in what we now call Iraq, somewhere in that region. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. And get this, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you, through this new nation, through the people I'm creating. Now, Abram takes this huge promise, and it really is huge. He takes it seriously enough to really trust that God's going to do it, such that he actually takes action. And so with his wife and also with a nephew, he moves about 1,000 miles to the west, and it doesn't take a plane, can't take a car. I mean, it takes a long, long time. And he goes to what we now call Israel, into the land of Canaan. And so he's got enough faith to take action. It's a risky deal. It's a costly kind of move that he makes. And hence, we often call Abraham, as he later is called, we call him the man of faith. He's kind of the man of faith. And he was. And yet this guy is human. He's just a man. He's got struggles. He stumbles. And that's exactly where God is needed and where God comes. In other words, he's a man like you and me. Faith and yet still struggling. And so just to anticipate where we're going to go with this, I've got this little survey. And I want you to see if you can identify with any of these. When God makes promises, how do you tend to respond? When God makes promises, how do you tend to respond? Few options. A, his offer can feel like it's not enough. B, it can seem like he needs outside help. C, his ways don't always make sense. One of the songs, beautiful song we did today, kind of touches on that. His claims can seem hopeless, kind of a mere dream. There's no way this promise can be real. But then he follows through in his way, in his time. Now you can look at that list, you can say, well, he's the answer you're supposed to give, right? That's the answer of faith, that he always follows through in his way, in his time. And Abram and Sarai eventually came to see that, and yet they were all over this. They were all of the above, and I would say we are too. And in fact, we really can't grow into full faith and hence joy and peace and hope and so on if we don't just real gut level honestly face that we're not there yet. And to acknowledge, to walk in the light and say, Lord, I believe, but part of me doesn't believe. I trust, and yet I struggle to trust. And that's exactly where God will meet you, in that kind of honest acknowledgement of the heart. So, but let's see how this gets played out with Abraham and Sarah. So go over to chapter 15 of Genesis. And this is where God renews that promise he gave in chapter 12. And it's a promise. This is a wonderful version of it. It's not just a promise of the land and a promise that, look, you and your wife are going to have a family, but he promises himself. He says, I am your reward. And that sounds about as good as it can get. But Abram has a question, verse 2. What can you give? What more can you give? It's kind of like, God, you're really good, but not quite enough. What more can you give since I'm childless? The promise was that we were going to have a kid, but so far we're childless. And you're great, but you're not quite enough. Your idea's fine, but kind of seems like maybe you need a little help here, Lord. So look at verse 3. Lord, I'll make my servant Eleazar the heir. We'll get this thing going in that way. And what does God say? No, the heir will be the son from your own body. Okay, now go down to chapter 16. It's 10 years later. And verse 1 and 2. What do we find there? Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. 10 years they've been waiting. But she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. And listen to this word. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Well, Abram agrees. And you can read on in the chapter. He sleeps with Hagar. She gets pregnant. She has a son. He's named Ishmael. And it seems like sort of a brilliant idea at the time, but it turns into a big mess. Sarai ends up despising Hagar and the kid, Ishmael, kicks them out. They end up in the desert. And God blesses Hagar and Ishmael. He takes care of them, but the deal is this was not his plan. It's not the way he wanted to fulfill his promise. So now go over to chapter 17. It's 14 years later. In other words, 24 years a kid's been promised. 24 years, there's no kid. All right, so that you can see where Abram and Sarai are wondering what's going on here. And yet up comes the promise again. God appears to Abram, renews the promise of a family. And this is interesting. He changes Abram's name at this point. So it goes from Abram, which kind of means, the gist of the name means super dad, kind of like a lot of you guys. But now it's Abraham, which means the father of many. Kind of interesting in light of the fact that this guy doesn't have any children yet. Father of many. And the promise is not just for Abram, but it's also for his wife Sarai. Her name gets changed to Sarah. And verse 16, chapter 17, God says, and I'll bless her. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. Well, look at Abraham's response in verse 17. He falls on his face. He falls on his face and he starts laughing. In essence, you got to be kidding me. And at this point, these folks are not young. I mean, you think I'm old. He's getting toward the hundreds. She's in her 90s, and it just doesn't seem realistic. And so, verse 18, Abraham's got another counter proposal. He says, "Hey, look, I've got a kid here, Ishmael. Why doesn't he be the one? If only Ishmael," Abraham says, "might live under your blessing." Well, that's not the plan. So now go to chapter 18. Again, God renews the promise of a child. And this time, Sarah is eavesdropping. She overhears this promise that's coming through some mysterious visitors that turn out to be angels and even the Lord himself. And as she hears the promise renewed that, Abraham, you're going to have a child, you're going to have a son, it's going to come through Sarah. What does she do? Verse 12, she laughs. She laughs. Though it's not as if it's funny or joyful, her own aged body, in her mind, reflects that these promises have gotten old and pretty worn out. And so the laugh is kind of cynical. Yeah, sure. And the claims seem to be hopeless, like, no way am I going to have a baby. But now let's let's see how that doesn't stop God. Go over to chapter 21, will you? And just one more passage here. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he'd promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. And jump down to verse 6. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter. God has brought me laughter. And everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. You know what the name Isaac means? It means laughter. So I don't know if any of you women are pregnant, but there's a name idea, either laughter or maybe Isaac. But this is the laugh, not the cynical laugh, not the laugh of disbelief. This is the laugh of joy. It's the laugh of God's goodness, of his grace. And you know what I want to tell myself and all of you today? God wants to put that name all over our lives. He wants to give us surprises. That the time may not seem all that good, but he wants to surprise us again and again with his ways of grace, of goodness, of life. And so I want to raise two questions for you this morning and myself. Today, just search your heart a little bit. How are there any ways that we're seeking God's good, and that is good, but we're kind of doing it by our own methods? We're seeking God's good, but by our own means. And it's kind of like we're trying to self-bless, almost without God. In other words, what are our Ishmaels? Just looking at this story. Things we want to try to produce on our own. Not necessarily bad, but less than God's best. And the second question is, how has God shown his way that's beyond what we could do on our own? And inviting us to trust him, to wait on him, to look for him, to follow him as he moves. In other words, what over and against our Ishmaels, what are our Isaacs? And those surprises that we open ourselves to, that we receive and then raise up with him. Now, I want to just give a couple examples, practical examples. The first is real personal. Once upon a time, my wife and I owned a car, and we named it Ishmael. Now, this is a long time ago. It was back when our three children were pretty little, and we were a little snobbish. We didn't want to be typical suburbanites. The last thing we wanted to do was to buy one of these new popular minivans. That's a little too middle class, white, suburban. But those kids were getting older, and all of a sudden we changed our perspective. Wow, it'd be nice to have one of those minivans. And so we started thinking about that, and we knew we couldn't quite afford it, at least yet. But we were driving around and thought, we'll just go into this car lot on Broadway and just sort of look at them, get an idea as to what they cost. Well, we were increasingly feeling that we now need a minivan. It's important. So we're talking to the sales guy, and you probably never heard this before. He said, tonight, I can give you a good deal on this. Not tomorrow. And he said, let me talk to my manager. Comes back, and the price is even lower. Well, guess what? We drove off the lot with a brand new minivan. We were about half a block down Broadway when we looked at each other and said, what did we just do? Again, not that it was evil, but it was 6 months, at least 6 months before it made sense financially. And as we drove off, we realized together that we had completely set aside 2 agreements that Darlene and I had made when we got married. 2 agreements among others. One was no major purchases, at least major purchases, on the same day we see the product or whatever. Sleep on it. You may say, wow, I'm glad we didn't buy it last night. But even more important, number two, we had agreed when we got married that we would not make any major decisions without going to God first. And just give him a chance to give us either a confirmation or maybe to point us some other direction. You know, as if he actually was Lord, as if he actually knew a little bit more than we did out of his great love. Well, we didn't do either one of those, of course, with this car. And for 9 years, and you see why we named it Ishmael? Kind of getting ahead of God there. Now, did God curse us? Did he punish us? No, Ishmael turned out to be a pretty good car for, I think it was about 9 years. But he was part of the blessing that we got. Just a reminder, a lesson from God. He basically was saying, hey, would you come to me first? Would you wait on me for my best? Would you give me first word? Give me first move? And then we'll move on together. And that was a really important practical lesson. For each day, for every decision, and for every opportunity that would come in life. And by the way, when Ishmael was in terminal condition and was ready to go to car heaven, Darling and I went to God together, and we found a car, and we named it Isaac. I think we're on Jehoshaphat now, right? I don't know. So, but let me give you one other context, and that's our shared life and ministry together. And especially you as Renovate Church. I once heard Larry Crabb, counselor, author, he was comparing two ways of doing church. And he said one way, the all-American way, is to make stuff happen, to make things happen. And he's exaggerating. There's a lot of hyperbole here. But he said the center of it all is to make things happen. Good things, to be sure, but to make things happen. And then that leads to strategies, and that leads to recruiting people, and that leads to programs. And there's nothing evil about that, but he said it's less than the best. He said there's another way of doing it, and that's to let not make our making something happen be at the center, but let God be at the center. Kind of makes sense, right? As if Jesus is the head of what is his church. And to really know him, to love him, and that overflows into loving community, the life we share together. That overflows into the release of gifts that sometimes kind of surprise us. I had no idea God sent this person with these gifts to advance than what is our mission together, not merely programs. Now, in this way of God being the center, now you still have strategies. You still have programs. You still recruit people and all that. But do you see the difference? Do you see what's at the center? What really drives it? It's not us. It's God. Jesus said to his disciples when Peter was the first to realize who he actually was, he talked about a church being built. First use of that term church, which isn't a building. It's not even an organization, it's a people, but Jesus did not say, now y'all go build the church for me. Remember, he said, I will build my church. And of course, we'll be part of it. We'll be working our tails off. But at the driving center is him. And I would say that to the degree this is true, they're both tendencies, but to simply make stuff happen, that's kind of like an Ishmael church. And I think what we want is a Christ-centered, Christ-led, Christ-driven church, more like an Isaac church. You see the difference? Now, my friends, I've been watching Renovate for Greg and Susan, about 3 years now? That you've been going and just kind of watching with gratitude and appreciation, respect, watching Renovate start up and grow up. And I really have come to know and appreciate Pastor Susan and Greg. Just love them. And I would say the heart and vision of Renovate is Isaac. It's all about Jesus, who's not just a figurehead, he's the head of the church. And it's not just an historical fact that he rose from the dead, but praise God, that's a fact. That's a reality of history. But it's a reality right now. The resurrection is now because he's real. He's over us, he's with us, he goes before us. And I know that's the heart and vision of Renovate, to be a kind of Isaac church that's open to God and his surprises. And you guys have had surprises, right? And, you know, a lot of times they're really disruptive. And yeah, I think looking back, you say, oh, yeah, I can see where God was really providing there. But, you know, the deal is it's easy for every single one of us to slip into trying to grab control and be more like an Ishmael sort of person or group. And so my encouragement is to just keep your eyes on Jesus as the living head of what is his church and his mission. Let him lead. Let him surprise you. And in the midst, have lots of spirit-filled laughter. And just put that name over everything and have the freedom to laugh, a holy laughter, because this great God is at work. So let me just ask again. How are we seeking God's good, but by our own ways, trying to self-bless? What are those Ishmaels? And I'd invite you to really think about that for a moment. But then how is God showing us his way, inviting us to trust and wait and watch and follow? What are his Isaacs in our lives?